Hello, Yen. Good to meet you. Thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Emma, and thank you very much for inviting me onto this remarkable series you've put together.
Great. Well, I look forward to getting to know you because we haven't met before. So why don't you start then by telling us your journey into Quakers? How did that happen, and what were you seeking, and what did you find?
Right, yes, I think I should say at the outset that I'm recently returned home from hospital where I had pneumonia, spent 5 weeks in hospital, so my voice might be a little bit croaky and I might need to cough, but let's hope
Yeah,
that
well, take
doesn't
it
happen.
easy. Yeah, take it easy.
Yeah, my journey into Quakerism, well, it was totally unexpected because I'd turned my back on organized religion. Um, I went to a Methodist school in Perth in Western Australia and got caught up in fundamentalism
Mm.
and came out the other end as an atheist, which was really just pushing off against the literal beliefs that I'd run into. And I think, in fact, I was searching for many years. Um, I was in the Australian diplomatic service and had postings in 4 different countries. So I was exposed a little bit to Buddhism and Islam and Hinduism, without taking a really serious interest in them. And then resigned and set up a translation business in this country. Um,
Mm.
and in the village where I lived in Cambridgeshire, we had a discussion group which arose out of the Sea of Faith television series
Right.
in the mid 1980s that was run by Don Cupid, the Anglican priest, controversial priest. And one of the people there had gone to the newly established Quaker meeting in Cambridge at Hartington Grove, and she told us what it was like. She had been to Sidcuit,
Mm.
so she had a Quaker background, but hadn't
Mm.
attended meeting for many years. And she said there are no priests and no prayers and no hymns and no liturgy. Um, and all this sounded very intriguing. And I thought, well, I'll go along just once and see what it's like. And I'll tick it off my list along with Buddhist ceremonies and Hindu occasions and so on. Well, Hartington Grove was a newish meeting. It had only been going for about a year or so. It was an overflow meeting from the two other meetings in Cambridge. And there were some wonderful people there. And I walked into that room wearing a jacket and tie, I remember, because I thought that's what you did. That was the last time. Um, and straight away was conscious of this almost bottleable atmosphere in the room, that the silence was holding us all. And I just melted into that. That was my coming home experience, I suppose. And there was some very fine ministry. As it happened, I'd been reading up on Hinduism at that stage. And right towards the end, an elderly woman got up and she quoted from the um, Upanishads. And I've got the passage here because it meant so much to me at the time. And it just summed up everything that we'd been talking about before. There is a spirit that is mind and life, light and truth and vast spaces. He contains all works and desires and all perfumes and all tastes. He enfolds the whole universe and in silence is loving to all. This is the spirit that is in my heart, smaller than a grain of rice or a grain of barley or a grain of mustard seed. And so it goes on. He enfolds the whole universe and in silence is loving to all. This is the spirit that is in my heart. Well, apart from the sexist language, the he's, I think it's a very beautiful passage, and I loved reading the Upanishads. That came as a real revelation because it was poetic, it was metaphorical, it wasn't to be taken literally. Um, like poetry, sometimes it's about the words behind the words, the sort of subliminal interpretations that we come to. And um, well, that was not just my last Quaker meeting, it was my first, and of very many. That was 40 years ago. So quite to my surprise, I found myself feeling utterly at home and at peace and nourished and challenged in Quaker meetings and read up as much as I could.
Mm,
Fox's Journal and Quaker by Convincement, I remember, was a very fine book.
mm,
Um, and it all seemed to fit.
yeah. So it's an interesting story you said about the beginning being caught up in fundamentalism. I'm wondering if you can tell us anything more about that that would put into context what you were searching for that had kind of not gone well for you then.
Well, I think nearly all people have some kind of religious instinct or awareness, and it can take many different forms. It can take secular forms. It can take the form of a deep appreciation of music or art or walking in the countryside or being kind to animals. Um, it's about an intimate connectedness with the world around us. And as an adolescent, I suppose one is um, influenceable. And yeah, I went along to Sunday school, and in a way, I'm very grateful to that because it gave me a familiarity with the Bible, which nowadays is less common. Um, it was at the time of Billy Graham preaching, and we were all meant to be born again. So I think there were two strands working there. One was this instinctive one that there is something beyond ourselves that we're in touch with in ways that aren't quite tangible, that you find in the depth of a Quaker meeting and is there in your life all the time. And then the way this had been given expression in a much more literal form, so that the wonderful mythology, as I see it, of the Bible became taken literally. And I simply couldn't understand how God could have a son who he then let be killed, and that solved all the problems surrounding sin. And it was a very sin-centered doctrine as well, which I felt uncomfortable with. So in the end, I rebelled against it.
Mm, mm,
Um, they asked me to speak at Sunday school about something called sacerdotalism. Well, I had to find the nearest dictionary and discovered it was all about the priesthood. And I'd been given a list of about 25 different things that I should address in my talk, like the status of the Virgin Mary and indulgences and um, all sorts of things about Catholicism that the Methodists didn't like. Um, and I found myself a bit like a barrister in court defending each of these propositions and seeing merit in the fact that women were recognized through Mary in the Catholic tradition in a way that Protestantism didn't provide provision for. Um, so I learnt a lot and I discarded a lot of stuff that didn't seem to fit. Um, and so of those two strands, the instinctive one sort of worked away, and the the fundamentalist one died a spectacular death.
mm,
Um, but as I say, that it wasn't all lost, and there were very fine people in that Methodist tradition as well. And I think there are many people who, like me, had doubts about it.
mm,
But it has left me uncomfortable with any faiths that are based on literal exposition of scripture, because that seems to me so precarious. We've had the Dead Sea Scrolls, which has revised some of what we think and know. Um, but what if something was came up that, uh, well, caused us to our views, revise our views of early Christianity or Islam or whatever?
Mm.
Um,
So, what of the born again experience? Were you were you ever directly kind of involved in that kind of?
oh yes, yes, yes. I went forward once, um, and well, it was a sort of semi-ecstatic experience. Um, but I did at the time think, what's this all about?
Mm,
Um, and then Billy Graham came to Perth, and there was a vast crowd, uh, and heard him again in Sydney, and um, it was very powerful with him singing and so on, terrific atmosphere generated. But I had no impulse to go forward at all. Um, no, that it wasn't a sort of rite of passage that really spoke to me, although the idea of being born again is a powerful one in all religious traditions,
mm,
of putting aside um, some worldly things that people do often attach a great deal of importance to. I mean, it's in the Tao Te Ching, for example, very strong in Taoism, um, and the theme of renunciation, of asceticism, um, is powerful in the Gospels and in Hinduism, and it means a reorientation of one's life to deeper things,
mm, mm,
um, and a dying to the self, and that I think is what the crucifixion is about. It's about a dying to the self. Um, so there is a powerful mythology there, but I think it needs to be seen in mythological and not
mm,
literal terms.
mm. One of the things that struck me about you, you said, you were very grateful for the biblical teaching and grounding you had,
Mm.
and that it's you said it's not as common nowadays, and I think that's true, it seems. And it concerns me a little bit that especially within the Quaker tradition here in the UK, that we're in an education system that doesn't provide as much religious education in the kind of the everyday sense. Yes, there's
Mm.
classes, but growing up, I went to a Christian-based assembly every morning, for example. Um, and I just wonder whether you've got any thoughts about how we do that at the moment within Quakers, because we don't really teach and center the Bible very much. And I wondered if you've got any thoughts about your own formation as a spiritual person yourself now, how central that was. Why don't we do that more now?
Well, it depends what speaks to you, I think, and increasing numbers of people are coming to Quakerism without an Orthodox Christian background. We do get the famous refugees from Anglicanism and Catholicism, but I think also there's a growing trend in society of people who have no formal religious background from the home or from school, um, but who are aware of something deeper in life. So you'll get young people who are interviewed and they'll say, "Oh, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual."
Hmm.
And that hunger, that awareness is there. And that's what can bring us to Quakerism. So you've got to be careful, I think, if you start heaping Christianity on top of that, that might not come very naturally to people. I think the beauty of Quakerism is that it is so stripped down, its religion stripped down to its absolute essentials, to the point that we get beyond words because the truth is beyond words. And we acknowledge that by sitting down in silence. Um,
Mm,
we, of course, have very solid foundations in Christianity. And I get upset when Quakers rebel against that. I think it's a very small minority who do. Um, but I have heard of meetings where people have been chastised for reading from the Bible or talking about Jesus. I think that's a great shame.
mm.
Um, but I'm thoroughly in the Universalist tradition, as you might guess.
Well, yes, yes.
And I like it when people quote from um, the Upanishads or Buddhist texts, um, and the whole wave of interest in meditation and mindfulness is much more an Eastern thing than a Western thing.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
and so you get people who come to Quakerism through Buddhism, and it's a very small step for them to um, fit into a Quaker meeting.
We've lost your video, Jan.
Oh,
So I'm just wondering about the background that people come to Quakers with, and you've had quite an eclectic background.
mm.
And I suppose one of the things that concerns me a little bit is that people who've come from very little religious education and formation perhaps need something more from us than we provide, whereas people like you especially have come with such a lot of religious experience and training. You perhaps fall into this quiet, free experience um, without the need for much more input. But can you see my point, if you like?
I can. It's a very interesting question. Um, I'm trying to think of people in my own meeting and other meetings I've attended. Most of them would have had some religious grounding, but you also get people, I think, with very little formal religious affiliation or background who come and who straight away slot in. Um, and you have to ask yourself why. So you don't need formal knowledge to take part in a Quaker meeting. It's very simple, as I say, stripped down, and people respect that and respond instinctively to it. Um, some people then have a thirst to find out more about our strange organization, the peculiar people, and others don't. Um, I'm thinking of a special meeting we had, a study session. Um, we were we were working on our spiritual review that we had to present to area meeting, which each local meeting does. And the clerk had a number of questions on things like what do you get out of Quaker meeting? Why do you keep coming to Quaker meeting? What would stop you coming to Quaker meeting?
Mm,
Um, and we all had little post-its and we wrote our comments and they were stuck up on the board.
mm,
And these were then read out. Now we're a fairly silent meeting and I did a lot of people, I really knew very little about their backgrounds or what they were getting out of Quakerism, how they were responding to it. And what was remarkable was the lack of difference between those who'd been attending for years and those who are newcomers, those with substantial religious background, those without. The answers all fell within a very narrow range, and I found that enormously um, comforting and encouraging because I had been sitting there in our often largely silent meetings thinking, what are the others getting out of this? Um, might they give up on us? Not a bit of it. Everyone felt the same way, which I thought was fascinating.
Mm.
I can think of two other occasions. One, we had a study session on God, and there were 10 of us. I think I was taking it, and I invited people to say what um, they thought of God, and there was total silence, which I thought was extremely eloquent. And then we had an area meeting residential with just over 50 people, and we conducted what was called a God snake. And a God snake gets you to line up with at one end people who have no belief in any form of um, deity, so materialists, reductionists, and at the other end, people who have a much more traditional view of um, a person, God. And all these people were totally bunched in the middle. So it was like the snake had swallowed a pig, and there was just one or two people at either end. And people were invited to speak to each other. Well, I've never seen a more animated group of Quakers. Um, and the idea was you'd change places if you felt that you were on the wrong part of the spectrum. But everyone was bunched in the middle with I think one exception of a woman who'd had a mystical experience as a little girl, persuading her that something was watching over her. So she put herself at the God end, but not in any really radical way. Um, so there is, I think, that unseen shared unanimity among Quakers,
Mm.
and that provides the basis for a gathered meeting.
So what do you do in meeting then? If there is largely silence, these are difficult things to articulate. But what do you do?
Well, I give thanks um, for a start because at home I find meditation, contemplation, worship, prayer, whatever you want to call it, really quite difficult.
Mm.
I don't have a sound religious practice, although I'd like to think that I have an awareness that I take into daily life so that I'm conscious of all the interconnections floating around me, of which I'm part. Um, I remember a famous yogi was asked how often he meditated, and he said, I don't meditate.
Mm.
Life is just one meditation. Um, and that's the way I'd like to approach things. Um, meeting provides a discipline is probably the wrong word because there's an element of coercion about that, but it provides a framework. When we were looking at this, oddly enough, at meeting last Sunday, saying how helpful it was to have other people there, creating an atmosphere which you could fit into, and I get through. That's not the right phrase, um, but I last the hour without any difficulty at all.
Mm.
And I suppose, like most Quakers, find myself drifting in and out. That um, I'll find myself wondering what I'm going to be doing later that day, and so on. But unlike, say, working with a mantra and group meditation, where there are devices to keep you mindful, Quakerism doesn't do that. So what your experience of meeting is up to you. Um, but subtly, we get pulled back to the center, I think. Um, we'll suddenly realize that our thoughts have drifted, has come back. Then there's that awareness of the group consciousness. Someone might minister. Um, so it's a very non-coercive setting. which I think works. That's for me.
Mm. Yes, and I suppose one of the things that I think about is it works for us who keep going. And the devices you talk about is one thing that I've been thinking about recently, is there may be some people who, to begin with, need a few more devices to help them settle into it. Um, and that's one of the things that, within chaplaincy, I have to use that really because people are coming into an experience they have no idea what
Mm.
we're about. Do you have any sense of that being a profitable or wise approach?
Well, we have all these pamphlets and leaflets that we give to people, which some people will read once they're in meeting. I think I'd answer your question. You mentioned chaplaincy. I was a Quaker prison minister for 5 or 6 years in Cambridgeshire,
No.
uh, and used to go into the prison every fortnight and hold a meeting for worship. And it started off very slowly with just one person, but it built up to about 9 or 10 would come. None of these people knew anything about Quakerism.
Mm,
Um, and they took to meeting like ducks to water. You didn't have to explain anything to them. They reveled in the silence. I don't think I've ever been to meetings that became gathered so quickly as in prison.
mm,
And this against the background of slamming doors and jangling keys and people shouting. For them, it was an oasis. Um, and uh, it went quite deep. They didn't minister, but they all said how much they appreciated the shared silence.
mm,
So there were people without formal knowledge, but going straight to the essence of the experience.
mm, mm. Yes, and I see a lot of people, perhaps even the majority, like that. But there is always a minority who, and nowadays the term being used and the diagnosis being used is ADHD, a kind of
Mm,
um, the fidgeters, if you like, the people who need to stand up and walk around, you know, who love to come along, but actually there's a bridging sense, and I wonder whether this is similar to the afterwards that we've developed, which is a
mm,
bridging out of it.
yeah.
There's some kind of bridging activity into it is supportive. Um, and I suppose the other thing that I've been thinking about why it might be helpful is what you were just saying about in our home lives. I'm very much like you. I find it very difficult to have a regular spiritual practice on my
Mm,
own, but that the group, you called it a
mm,
group consciousness, is really, really helpful. And and one of the things that I've been thinking about is some kind of guided recording like this, which just keeps everyone together, if you like. Now, if nobody's saying anything at all, that's less straightforward. So it's one of the things that I'm experimenting with, so that people have some access to that experience from their own homes for whatever reason. I suppose I'm thinking about giving people different ways in to the
mm.
experience. Um,
Well, we have Zoom now, which is a way in for some people and also a way out for some people because they don't really respond to it. Um,
mm,
I don't, I mean, I love Zoom business meetings um, because they save so much time in terms of travel and they can be extremely efficient. Um,
mm,
but in terms of worship, I find them, for me, I find it very hard to settle, whereas some people get a lot out of it.
mm. Can you tell me anything about ministry in that You described yourself as a universalist, and
Mm.
you also said that the Bible's important. So I'm wondering whether would you call yourself a Christian universalist, perhaps? I'm not sure. I'm just wondering what your ministry is like and whether you use God, Jesus, the Bible. Tell me more about that.
Um, yes, I will occasionally refer to Jesus and especially the Gospels, the teachings. Um, I probably minister far too often and should be reprimanded, um, eldered. And yeah, I will draw on other traditions as well. I mean, I suppose what has affected me has been what's called the perennial philosophy, which um, draws the essence from many of the great faiths. And I think is Quakerism is bang at the middle of that. So that the things that I tend to gravitate towards in my ministry are about that essential awareness. Awareness is a very important word for me. That we have that sense of contact with the unseen, what Rufus Jones called the great beyond. Um, and uh, yeah, I won't use the word God because it's historically an overworked word and can give rise to misunderstanding, I think. Um, and I think it's really quite beautiful when we do try to find words for whatever God is. Um, Again, we come back to poetry. It's what's not expressed that matters. And um, I think we have found some ways of conveying what's beyond words.
Mm. And you said you minister perhaps too often. Um, I'm probably guilty of the same. What's the process you go through personally?
Um, well, in the early days back in Cambridge, there was a very clear sense of feeling called, of getting the thumps, um, to the point that it became quite uncomfortable and just had to get up. And that's faded a bit. I still get flutters, I suppose, rather than thumps. Um, I fight against it, fight against ministering, um, which I think is a healthy thing to do. Um, and these days, I usually find myself, if I minister, leaving it till fairly late in the meeting, um, so that it then becomes a bit of a distillation of what's gone on before. Um, and I find that I don't minister very much on political themes, even though I feel them keenly.
Mm.
And I know that in many meetings, people do. They'll be talking about Gaza and talking about Ukraine and Sudan and Myanmar. These are difficult things to talk about because you run into a sort of helplessness.
Mm.
And ultimately, the way we approach these huge issues has to be based on our underlying spiritual approach. And that's what
Mm.
I think we should nurture in Quaker meeting. And action will come out of that, as it does in the form of charities that we support and things that we do in my local area.
Mm.
Um, For example, we have an away day every year for refugees from Wolverhampton. They
Mm.
come by coach, about 50 of them, and one of our members has some farmland, and we put up marquees and we give them lunch, and the children play in the river, and it means an enormous amount to them. Um, and other members of the community, non-Quakers, have come to help because they are also keenly aware of um, the desperate need and how difficult people's lives can be, people who've reached this country.
Yes, there's something there about action, isn't there? Um, Rather than talking about the politics, and that's something that's very close to my heart, really, because one of the powerful things I think Quakers can do well to have a real impact is to be reminding people of the divine presence in our lives and
Mm.
the the refreshing nature of that, that you don't burn out, you know. And I sense sometimes there's a danger within a Quaker community towards burnout, if that's perhaps a helpful way of putting it.
Well, the spiritual foundation has to be very strong. If you take something like climate change, it's very easy for us to be caught up in the sort of secular protests. Um, but I think in the end, if we're to make real progress, it will only be because spiritual factors come to the fore, that we realize that we can't continue leading the kinds of lives that we are, and we need to get back to a reverential approach towards nature. Um, and I think that may come, but not until after considerable calamity.
Mm, mm. So let's stick with the with this issue for a minute. You said that you think there could be considerable calamity.
Mm.
Um, I mean, I hear some of the criticisms of the net zero approach, if you like, that's what I hear people say is that this is a poverty approach, basically, that we're asking people to live in poverty. Um, if we try to say you have to change the ways of living your life.
Mm.
Do you think that is what Quakers are advocating in terms of our simplicity and sustainability testimonies?
I think to some extent we are. I think we are pushing back against the endless growth um, paradigm that we're caught up in, and ultimately has to be unsustainable. Um, but when I talk about calamity, I think it means that we will have some simplicity forced upon us because people are going to find that vast tracts of land become uninhabitable. We'll have fires, we'll have floods, we'll have tempests, um, and we're already seeing that on a substantial scale. Ocean levels are set to rise significantly. There are all sorts of possible feedback loops that are just getting into action. So um, I think there could be huge adjustments in the way that people live, and those will involve a return to deprivation and poverty, I fear.
Mm. And I suppose this comes to our um, advices and queries of a life of simplicity voluntarily
Mhm.
chosen. It is the way forward before it becomes forced upon us.
Yeah, um, there are things that we can do that I don't think would affect our welfare and happiness to any significant degree. Um, I mean, I haven't flown in an aeroplane for quite a long time. Um,
Mm,
and yes, the whole consumption thing has got seriously out of hand, I think.
mm,
Uh,
yeah. Can I come back to asking you a bit about ministry? You said something interesting there around fighting it, and that fighting ministry is a healthy thing. Some other people I've spoken to say how much they need ministry. They need
mm,
to hear ministry from other people.
mm.
And I think for some people, and I'm not one of these actually, I don't need ministry nowadays, but I used to. And that without ministry, if it's a very silent meeting, you almost have some, I don't know, some kind of existential angst or something, some kind of, your own spiritual lack, if you like, is obvious to you. And I can see that when you're in that phase of your life or, for a period of time, hearing other people's ministry is so enriching. Do you not think that's a very good reason for not fighting too much?
Yeah, well, it's a matter of striking the right balance. Um, I think you should test the the call or the feeling that you should minister, and not just leap to your feet. Um, I mean, there are the wonderful Ten Commandments of ministry. I don't know whether you've seen them, but
Well,
one of them is consider that this might be an early arrival for next week. Uh, um, yeah, so I think a certain amount of sifting and scrutiny and assessment beforehand is desirable. But and then you sort of sink into the subject and feel you have to get to your feet and share.
mm,
Um, but it's a scary experience, I
mm,
think, and you're often left wondering how it goes down with other people. Um, is it a vain and presumptuous thing to stand up when so few people do?
mm,
So I think it is something to be approached with care and humility. Um, but you're right. We do need a balance of silence and ministry, and the interaction between the two can be very powerful. Uh, in my experience, people rarely talk from personal experience. Uh, I'd like there to be more of that, even though it can feel exposing. And a lot of ministry can tend to be secular.
mm. Mm. Yes, I mean, I do think it is a vain and presumptuous thing, and I think that's what's horrifying about it, really. I
Mm.
think I feel that tension every time that this is a vain and presumptuous thing to stand up and minister every single time. And yet I also feel it's something that I can't avoid, and it's in some way necessary. And I'm willing, I suppose, to put myself through that.
Yes, and I think we need to recognize that the urge to speak to minister is arising out of the group consciousness. So you could be responding to what people said before, or to a reading, or you may just be picking up something in the general atmosphere, because how often have you heard people minister and then someone else will say, he or she picked the words out of my mind?
Mm,
Um, and a sort of general theme can emerge. So there is something going on there. Um, because I think we, particularly in Western culture, have become overly individualistic. I think the boundaries of the individual are very permeable, and that we are caught up with the world around us to a much greater extent than we normally will admit, and those boundaries dissolve in a Quaker meeting.
Mm.
Um, and so, yeah, we do need to respond to the promptings to minister.
And when you say it can sometimes be too secular,
Mm.
is that the same as what you were just saying about being overly political? Or is that a slightly different?
Well, that would certainly be part of it. Yeah. Um, yeah, overly secular. Yeah, well, trying hard to think of some examples, but um, yeah, yeah, perhaps we should leave it. I don't want to be critical of what other people have said because sometimes they can have unexpected effects
Mm,
on other people.
mm. Yes, it's tricky, isn't it? This idea of being critical of ministry. Um, and I find myself being critical of the pronouncements being made all the time around political issues. And I realize it's very tricky ground. Um, but I suppose rather than just criticizing what is said, I suppose what I'm also more mindful of is what's not being said. So I
Mm.
suppose I'm critical, for example, of pronouncements out about various wars, and rather less being said about these kinds of spiritual practices,
Mm.
about the importance of God, however you want to conceptualize that, or the importance of our spiritual practice. And
Mm.
we have much less to say about that.
Yeah, I
And I
agree.
don't understand why.
Well, again, I think it's a matter of people feeling who am I to pronounce on these things.
Hmm.
There's a reticence there.
Okay, but how is it that we have prominent Quakers in some cases, paid employed to do this for us, and there's a confidence around a particular statement around war, for example, and no confidence about prayer.
Mm.
How is that?
Well, don't you think that subjects like prayer do get dealt with through Quaker life?
I don't know. Does it?
So you think there's a lack of spiritual nurturing within meetings?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think this is why I've been, I feel led to have had all of these conversations, is to
Mm.
really talk about that thing that you mentioned a few minutes ago, that it's all very well having these great movements of spirit towards acting
Mm.
against climate change or whatever, but that they have to be deeply spiritually grounded.
Yeah.
If you can't articulate that and show that and, you know, um, lead with that,
Mm.
then I'm just not as convinced by your political pronouncements, and I don't
Mm.
really want to hear about them. So for me, it has to be front loaded with
Yeah.
a deep spiritual practice. And as a body, I don't think we say that. We don't say that to each other. We don't say. Look, hold on there, friend, until you can talk to me about the deep spiritual practice that has created that.
I don't know. I mean, QPSW talks about faith in action. And I think there is an awareness that these are two horses drawing the carriage, um, and that the action arises out of the faith, has to arise out of the faith.
Oh, I hope so. So let's talk about your hopes for the future then, or whether that's the immediate future or the longer future. What are Quakers still, relevant, if that's the word? Do we still have something to offer? In What's your hopes for the future?
Well, I think Quakers have an enormous amount to offer, and it just puzzles me that people aren't streaming through our doors. If you look at the emphasis on mindfulness and meditation, you'd think it's a very small hop from there to a Quaker meeting, but people don't make that hop. Um, and that's where I think we need to help them, um, not in the sense of proselytizing, but because I think that people would find it very helpful to share in the silence that we do. Um, and again, in terms of faith in action and what you were saying about political action needing to be spiritually grounded, um, there I can see a very significant role for Quakerism. Whether it will ever achieve it is another matter. But I'm encouraged by some of the things that are happening, and curiously enough, by social media, which I think we're using skillfully, um, with, say, discovering Quakers, and there's an enormous amount online now, and the kinds of people we need to reach often make a lot of use of social media.
Mm.
Um, so I think there's that huge potential that's lying there, untapped, that is needed in our society, which is in many ways so dislocated, so uneven, so unfulfilled at a deep level. Um, and people are turning their backs on formal religion,
Mm.
partly because of education and approaching things from a scientific point of view. Um, but then they do acknowledge that there's a spiritual dimension to life as well. And what Quakerism does is expand it beyond the individual. Because I think if you just have a spirituality which is confined to yourself, then that's limited and much less rich than working in a bigger group. So
Mm.
you have the sort of inner circle of yourself, and then the Quaker circle, which is a bit bigger, and then that spreads into society. And that, to me, is a very significant difference from the um, Orthodox services I used to go to as a child, when you'd A, dress up, wear a jacket and tie, and B, felt cut off from the rest of society. They were the peculiar people who were sending this Sunday morning in an ornate building. Whereas in a Quaker meeting, I have and I think most people do have a strong sense of connection with the outside world. So you move from your own little inner circle to the Quaker circle, and wider again. And they're the kinds of forces that I think are badly needed in society. And that's why I remain hopeful about the future of Quakerism. I think we are changing rapidly. We're adapting to social media. Um, so I think I'm more confident about Quakerism now than I was, say, 20 years ago.
And do you think we get that messaging right? I mean, as you say, why aren't people streaming through the doors when we offer something very special? W w One of the things that I suppose I would like to see is something along the lines of, a Christian-based universalism
Hmm.
is what I think we offer. I think we offer a spiritual community, as you've just talked about, to move away, to guard against this individualism. We have a message of simplicity which guards against the overconsumption. And we have a spiritual practice of centering down and experiencing the stillness and really listening to what a spirit-led life might look like. And I wish we talked more about that.
Mm. I think we are beginning to talk about that, and the posters you see outside Quaker meeting houses are often based around the testimonies. They emphasize peace and simplicity and equality and truth. And I'm a member of the Quaker Truth and Integrity Group,
Mm,
which is doing what it can to um, keep those values to the forefront in political and social public life. Um, One of the problems we have, I think, is language that's been handed down that's rich and full of meaning for many people, but which can be off-putting for others. And I'm thinking again of posters outside a Quaker meeting house will say meeting for worship 10:30 on Sunday. And some people will see that and walk straight on because it means nothing to them,
mm,
meeting for worship. In fact, it'll have a negative connotation. And I've raised this in some recent meetings and been surprised at the vehemence with which that view has been opposed, that people feel we should stick to the term worship and God. And these, curiously enough, we're younger friends. Um, so I may have got that wrong, but I feel that these are old-fashioned terms that will stop people coming through the door, and that we're on safer ground promoting the testimonies and conveying the underlying spirituality.
well, that's interesting. I suppose I am of the view that God is good and worship is good, and that more of the spiritual practices is what we somehow need to convey. But nonetheless, I think you're right about how we change meeting for worship. I don't think we necessarily lose that term, but how do we advertise, I suppose, the fact that we have a process and a community? Because I wonder whether you see the new generations coming through are moving back towards religion.
Mm.
Um, and therefore, what we think might be off-putting is perhaps coming back again, and maybe we need to talk more about Christianity, more about worship, more about, and potentially use the word mindfulness as well,
Mm.
using more of this type of language.
Yes, it's very hard to know what other term to use. I mean, you can't say meeting for shared mindfulness 10:30 on Sunday. But that's what it is.
Mm, interesting. Well, thank you so much, Jan. It's been a very interesting conversation. And your voice held up very well. Uh,
Yes, it did. I'm quite pleased by that.
yes, yes.
Perhaps I've
Thank,
recovered more than I realize.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma.